We are going to now have our discussions from our breakout groups. Each representative is going to have about 5 minutes or so to share with us what their groups talked about, what were some of the major themes, and then we will have time for questions after everyone has presented. Okay? One thing that we want to note is we want to welcome the Millennium Scholars Program participants here with us at the pre-conference. We're excited that you're joining with us and have this opportunity to think deeply about these issues. And also we hope that during the lunch period you will take the opportunity to get to know some of the other participants here for the pre-conference. So first, from the Conceptualizing and Measuring Race and Ethnicity with Diverse Samples, we have Dr. Deborah Rivas-Drake to bring comments.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. All right, good. Okay, so our group was very energized by this topic and had a lot to offer in terms of the issues that have come up in our own work, in terms of challenges and then ways of overcoming some of those challenges. But obviously there are no, really clear, easy solution to these issues. But we were all very excited about, providing or thinking about ways to provide guidance to the field. Some of the things that we ask and discuss are reflected in the 3 questions that we asked. So I'm just going to tell you what the questions were. So the first question was, how can developmental scientists take history and context of the target population into consideration when conceptualizing and measuring race and ethnicity? So really, how do you get into the context and history, and how do you think about those issues and bring them into your work? And one of the things that we talked about was that it really can happen at all different aspects of the research timeline, so at all different points, from your theorizing and just even what theories you're drawing on, to your design, your recruitment, and these sorts of issues that play out there. And then, in your analysis, right, and your measurement, obviously, your analysis, and interpretation. So that's, I'll say a little bit more about that later. The second question that we asked discussed was what should be the role of power in our conceptualizations of race and ethnicity? And the third one was often race and ethnicity are treated as categorical grouping variables and labels in research. How do we expand our conceptualization given the given changing demographic shifts? So a lot of these really sort of resonated or have like an interplay, right? If we think about taking local context into consideration in whatever phase of your research, or even thinking about the questions that you're formulating, you already maybe are engaging issues of power and privilege. And so we talked about that. One of the groups mentioned really struggling with, or just trying to really capture the historical legacy of war and colonization in their samples, and sort of how do you really do justice to that, and thinking about the way that different groups interact together as potentially as a consequence of shared histories around or histories that are informed by issues of war and colonization. And then in terms of issues of power, we spent a lot of time collectively really thinking about the role of power at different levels. So one is really thinking about the nature of in-group and out-group dynamics, and who's in an in-group, and then within in-groups, issues of power that arise in terms of how they interact and engage one another, and things like colorism, and how do you factor that into your work and think about that. Another way that power plays out is in thinking about how you approach your communities, right? Your research participant communities. And one participant mentioned a really interesting example of how do you broach the subject of collecting biomarker data in a way that's really sensitive, and thinking about like the history of how biological data has been used or groups have been exploited, right? And so how do you think about that and also bring, like get great data and really answer these questions? They need to be represented in this field, this aspect of the field, but really help unpack, like, why do you need my hair and why do you need my saliva and all of that sort of, those issues. Yes, and scans of my brain as well, I'll say that. A lot of discussion was spent thinking about categorization, so our third question. And I know many of us probably have struggled with this issue, even if you have a so-called monoracial sample, really doing justice to the nuances of self-labeling or just like categorization and who's included in a category or an ethnic or racial category. And we spent a lot of time thinking about how to do it from the ground up, but also the tensions that arise when you do a ground up kind of approach with kind of balancing that with the needs to compare or think across shared experiences and just actual, sort of dilemmas in terms of analysis and equivalence issues, for example, in being able to speak to the experiences of multiple groups if you have a diverse sample. And one takeaway point that I'll say from my subgroup that I think would be interesting for all of us to think about is often the multiracial individual context is one that really presents a lot of these challenges are sort of like inherent in the issues that come up in studying and really doing justice and kind of thinking about multiracial experience with nuance. And so sometimes we think about them as sort of like, this group, we don't know what to do with them, and there's monoracial as sort of like the norm. But what if we turned the tables and we said, okay, what if multiracial became the norm, and then we drew all of the insights, that we can from how to approach and think about issues of, discrimination, identity, labels, consistency over time, cultural practices, and so on, and brought that to kind of reflect and maybe revise our approach to studying so-called monoracials. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
I'm taking notes because we had no time to. Okay. All right. Oh.
Hello. Oh, there you go. Hi. So for the Intersectionality group, we have Dr. Carlos Santos, who's going to be sharing the thoughts on that group.
Okay, thank you. So as I was violently trying to get all this info summarized, hopefully I'm doing a relatively good job at covering some of the main themes we talked about. So one of the key things we discussed early on was the need to, or the importance of emphasizing the ways in which we missed a point on intersectionality when we reduce it to simply talking about intersecting identities. That was one of the first things we discussed. So we highlight the need, we discussed the importance of noting that it's ultimately not only about the identities, it's about the oppressions that are associated, the overlapping systemic oppressions that are associated with different intersecting identities. So that was one of the first things we discussed. The other thing that came up was the importance of citing Black women. It's one of the things that in various pieces I've been involved in, and acknowledging the roots of intersectionality in Black feminist thought. Not only we should not only cite Crenshaw, we should cite Crenshaw, but also visit or learn, if we haven't, about Black activist, queer Black activist work that precedes Crenshaw's in the 70s, Combahee River Collective, and other texts that have been influential in shaping what we now call intersectionality. We then talked about thinking of intersectionality as a framework versus a theory. It was a brief discussion, but one of the things we talked about was if you think of it as a framework, it might afford certain things. So you can think of how you might attend to multi-level intersectional stigma, for example, in your design, right? So you can think about how intersectional stigma might play out in micro systems, meso, macro, and so on. So that was one of the ideas we discussed. The other idea was, and also by thinking of of it as a framework, we might be able to better attend to issues of social justice, to incorporate intersectionality roots in activism within our design, and so it sort of affords certain opportunities. If we think of it as a theory, which some argued in favor as well, you can think of the testable claims that are in intersectionality, so this notion that overlapping systemic oppressions create unique conditions that have consequences for individuals, right, that experience multiple forms of oppression. So the opportunities and limitations of thinking of both intersectionality as a framework as a theory. We talked about the importance of narratives to help inform intersectionality research in developmental science. So one of the examples we talked about, so if you're studying gendered racism with Black girls, for example, there may be themes that would be missed entirely if we're simply adapting existing measures that are out there. So that was a recurring theme, the importance of having these narratives represented in developmental research, so as to inform where we might go in terms of measurement and so on. And one of the things we talked about that I haven't mentioned relates to theory and framework is this notion of not only we can think of how intersectionality might inform design, but also we can, we now have evidence of how we can use intersectionality to inform measures, right? So we have various examples now of measures that have been published that are capturing intersectional phenomena. So gendered racial microaggressions by a colleague, Joni Lewis in Knoxville, in Tennessee, who has developed that scale in her work with Black women. So we now have these examples of these measures that are out there. I think one of the interesting things, Mia, that I came up, and I'm curious if what folks' assessment, but I felt it was a really sort of a point of tension, perhaps. This idea of, is intersectionality for everyone? And I think that's something that I certainly sort of don't know where I think we're still kind of making sense of that, and I think there was some sort of perhaps slightly different, but sort of complementary perspectives on that. So that may be something worth, I think, further thinking. And also the issue of, if we're thinking about overlapping systemic oppressions, then how do we think of overlapping systemic oppressions and privilege, overlapping privilege with oppression, right? So the idea of extending our this work on overlapping oppressions to also think about privilege, right? So I'd sort of use myself as an example. As a queer Latino man, I may experience certain forms of heterosexism, certain forms of racism based not on appearance so much, but name, et cetera. But I'm also a man, and there's privilege. And so thinking of sort of racism, heterosexism, and how that intersects with privilege as something that we haven't quite as much thought of in this line of work. Mia, we have a little bit. Do you want to? Is there anything that you think I'm?
I think that. That makes sense. And then also, what do we do with that? How do we measure it? And then I think that the one kind of pushback that concern reflects is that as you move it out of the Black feminist space, will that contribution begin to be obscured as you start to think about privilege?
That's right.
Okay, so Dr. Brandon, you will talk about and I will chime in on the unique issues with multiracial populations.
So some of the things that we sort of broke our section of multiracial and multi-ethnic conversation to theory and methods, and so I kind of led the theory, and then Gabby ran the sort of the methods, so we'll kind of bounce back and forth. But related to theory, I think we started off a conversation with what is the difference and similarities between multiracial, multi-ethnic, and multicultural, and that led to this sort of fruitful conversation, a very complicated conversation of the different sort of roles and dynamics that are involved in those different sort of meanings and how they vary by context, by group membership, among other sort of factors that may make these meanings very differently. Within that conversation, one in particular was the role of power and privilege, specifically approximation to whiteness as we sort of look at multiracial. Again, multiracial is not a new phenomenon, it's been here for a really long time, but within the context of race and racism, and white supremacy more specifically, multiracial and the study of multiraciality has been invisible within that process. So how do we sort of challenge as we continue to work in multiracials, not become invisible or take into account the consideration of white white supremacy, in particular in making some of these communities and conversations more essentialized or monoracial consistent, rather than being something, a new phenomenon. So to give some highlight to what that means in terms of that sort of approximation to whiteness, we talk, for example, also about sort of the assumptions of stability around our identities, right? So how our identities, particularly monoracial groups, are assumed to be stable, and that sort of at the end of that we have a sense of commitment or achievement, whereas with multiracials that may not be the case, that multiracial identities can be fluid, not only based on how one identifies themselves, but how other people identify themselves, as well as the context in which those identities are expressed, depending on the needs or the situation, as well as the particular sort of roles of phenotype, right? Particularly with multiracial children, phenotypes changing over the years, how do those processes of identity identification and context sort of shift those understanding developmentally, in addition to how do they start to understand those processes, being context sort of dependent, and the assumption that it's not always sort of stable. So again, really sort of highlighting the difference in multiracial identification versus sort of the process, or capturing sort of the process, which may challenge sort of these reductionist monoracial sort of frameworks. Some of the...
Yeah, I can add a little bit from the methods group. We talked a lot about the focus on identity as being a lot of what the measurement has focused on, and other aspects of multiracial experiences haven't been as explored as much, sort of socialization and discrimination. Some measures are out there, but still more is needed. And sort of what does it mean about values, right? How do you endorse values around different cultural groups? We talked about just the inherent differences in defining a multiracial population, and does it, when you think about a multiracial population uniformly versus all the different combinations that can be, like if you look at studies of multiracial youth, it's like 22 different combinations. So they don't fit into boxes that we're wanting to, and funders want us to describe in our samples. And how do you honor that and think about how you define multiraciality, whether it's your parental lineage, right? Your biological parents and their racial identity, and what if they're multiracial, and sort of at what point, sort of how do we even think about that, is something we really thought about, as well as sort of the idea of the stability and the fluidity, right, and integration. And some of the measures that we have now, sort of that stability could be, fluidity could be a positive fluidity if it's integrated and you're sort of shifting in settings, or if it could be imposed on you, that you have to behave in different ways, and that could feel like different, right? So even how we think about what does fluidity mean and how to make sense of that. And then there was another sort of aspect of the conversation around sort of measurement, and sort of thinking around how do we measure when these measures have been developed in very specific multiracial groups. And then thinking also like that there was a plea by one of our participants about, in a public health data set, when each item costs you $100,000, like how if you have a 56 item measure, that may not be as useful, right? And so how and when do we think about measurement? And that both of these types of studies exist that go deep, but also that we need to also think about measurement that can be broadly applied to larger population-based studies if we're searching to end inequity, right? Because inequity is happening at all these levels, and so we really need to think about that in our measures. I don't know if you had other...
Yeah, just add to that some more specific examples. Like when we look at discrimination, for example, like multiracials have sort of a unique sort of set of experiences, right? That in terms of the physical, ethnic ambiguity, socialization may look very different because you don't have a parent of two same racial background. Rather, you have parents of different racial backgrounds, or could have different racial backgrounds. So whose responsibility is racial and cultural socialization? How does that impact a child? In my case, is my white partner sort of responsible, or am I responsible? Does that have a differential effect in how we racially socialize our children? So these are conversations that are, I think, absent in the larger sort of monoracial literature in terms of those unique experiences, resiliencies that haven't been sort of started to talk about. Rather, I think often the papers that I see is this sort of generalizability or assumption of monoracial sort of theories that are sort of kind of forced, particularly the idea of stability, that identity has to be stable, that these experiences have to sort of fit into these boxes. are the things I think that perpetuate a particular sort of myth.
Yeah, and we talked a little bit also about like family identity versus self-identity and who decides racial ambiguity. Like, so if we ask how racially ambiguous are you, that's your perception of your racial ambiguity versus, and the feedback, and how you're interpreting the feedback you're getting around racial ambiguity versus someone else's sort of, you know, assessment of your racial ambiguity. So who do we ask, like who's giving that information? Is it your parents? Is it you? Is it your child? Is it, so we talked a little bit about that, and then socialization influences outside of the parents, right? Your peers, your siblings, the people you may be dating. So these socialization messages that you're getting around multiracial identity from multiple places and in the same family, you know, that siblings may share different multiracial identities, right, and different sort of engage. And so how does that even impact how everyone is, how do we even measure all of that complexity is really challenging. I think that's good. I think we're ready for questions. So now at this point, we're going to open it up. Don and I are going to go in the audience with our handy microphones. And so ask questions to our panelists or just share thoughts that you want the audience to respond to. And then we will be having lunch in about 15 minutes. So 15 minutes.
Could I ask a question?
Intersectionality in multiracial experiences that I meant to say around sort of the, so if there's sort of gendered sort of multiracial experiences that are unique, right? Sort of the foreignness that is ascribed to multiracial women and exoticism and sexualized, or immigrant or language use, and that there's these other parts of intersectionality that then is even complicated, right? Which one? Class. Yes, we talked about class and how that's, so. Anyway, so you can ask a question, but you reminded me I was going to say that.
So I guess my question is related to your session, and I'm curious. You know, you mentioned and you talked about this notion of fluidity, right? In terms of as being an important theme in how we in studying multiracial youth and adults, and I keep thinking, this is something I've sort of thought about. I mean, we don't really engage with that question as much in developmental research in general around racial socialization, racial identity development. And, you know, we know that if you look at just immigrant folks that are coming in first gen, their identification, the way, right, they have a position that may be ascribed to them within a U.S. racial ethnic schema, but they themselves may differ in how they see themselves relative to these sort of classifications over time, right? So often, you know, you might see recent immigrant families identifying as their country of origin primarily. Their kids who are inserted in formal schooling, in formal institutions, right? They're exposed to U.S. kind of racial ethnic categorization. They may be more likely to identify within the racial ethnic groups that, right? Of course, one is nationality, the other one's racial, identity, racial grouping. But it is a question that I think we don't grapple with enough, which is this notion of we know that the positions that are ascribed to us may be there regardless of but our relationship to those positions and how that might change over time is, I think, an interesting theme that is underexplored or not always a focus of work we've done. So I don't know if you have any sort of thoughts on that, but in general, I kept thinking about how we don't really explore that question of fluidity and changes in our relationship to identity labels.
Yeah, as you were saying that, it made me think about one of the models that I shared in our group discussion by Carrie Ann Rockamore on racial identity, and her models are different from like a lot of multiracial identity models in the sense of that fluidity is captured in the model. So racial identity, racial identification, and racial identity, identification, racial category. So how one see their race versus how other people see their race, as well as a context in which I can express certain racial identity, are always in play together simultaneously. These are Venn diagrams that overlap. That depending on the situation, these things may change constantly. And so obviously the understanding of that from an immigrant perspective or a acculturated perspective are going to be consistently changing within those three, regardless of whether you're an immigrant or not. But that's something that I thought about. But
there's a question in the front.
Hi, Sorry, it's loud. So just a thought, I participated in the multiracial subsection, but a lot of what we talked about was thinking about parents' lineage of being of more than one race, but we didn't talk about transracially adopted family constructs, and I was just kind of curious if that type of family would be also included in a conversation or in the measures of a transracial child who is, you know, racially monoracially themselves, but are raised in a family that looks different than they do. So I was just kind of curious if that came up in the other sessions, and also how we think about that in a multiracial way.
I tend to think about what you mentioned in racial ethnic socialization context, so I think that work belongs in that field of study. And I think one of the risks is some of what we've talked about, like in the intersectionality group, is taking a framework that was developed on largely minority parents, but not exclusively minority parents, parenting kids of the same race or ethnicity. And really, for transracially adopted kids, it's really sort of like a family that may have one lived experience, but from the parents' perspective, wrestling with the lived experience of the kids that differs based on the differing race, ethnicity of everyone involved. And so I think in going about that work, there are some components that actually make sense to retain. If you're talking about white parents raising minority kids, that's what a lot of the work is right now. But I think that as that field evolves, that the next step is really looking at models that are grounded in white racial socialization and applying it to the lived experience of minority kids, whether you're talking about Asian American, African American, Latino, Native American, that there needs to be a meshing and a merging of those two. And what people tend to do is take the one model and say, okay, so white parents are supposed to do cultural mistrust, preparation for bias, and why would a white parent teach cultural mistrust in the conventional sense, which really came up out of like the Jim Crow South, right? So thinking more critically around what does it mean to be white. We were talking about whiteness in the intersectionality space, and really thinking about, do we have adequate measures? Do we have really good descriptions that apply in a developmental science context? Once that work is done, or if people are doing that, that's really where the essence of understanding what those kids' lives will be like, I think, is.
Is it open? Yeah. Hello, my name is Nicole. I just had a comment about Black immigrants and socialization, just personal experience and what I've read in the literature. And it is true that, like, in terms of Black immigrants, like, socialization practices are different compared to African Americans. And just growing up in a Jamaican household, it is very different. My mom never talked about race and racism, and so when I got to Penn State, it was a huge culture shock when a white student first called me the N-word, nigger. And just from what I've read in the literature and even in Dr. Chi's class, we talked about Ferguson's tri-dimensional acculturation framework, how Black immigrants orient towards three cultures. That's European American culture, the African American culture, and their own culture. And even in a paper that I read by Joseph and Hunter, I believe, how whenever Black immigrants, specifically Haitians, socialize their youth in terms of promotion of mistrust, they usually caution them to be wary of interaction with African Americans rather than white Americans, and that's because of that idea that there's just hostility and like sort of a race between African Americans and Black immigrants. So yeah.
That tension, I think, requires a lot more research attention. I think that a theme of the comments from the intersectionality section, so not to belabor the point, is that so there's multiple models of racial and ethnic socialization. There's the dominant one, which is a Hyung's framework. But there are other ones that are out there that people are using based on the populations that they're studying, that to take those constructs and apply them wholesale and uniformly to some of these other experiences of people with Black and brown skin
you're going to have some generalized ability issues, and I think that's what your personal account is indicating, that you don't see an analog for that in the existing literature, which means that there needs to be further articulation of what that experience is about. Some of the work, the things we've seen in my own work is that the kids of Black immigrants, that there's a fluidity to how they identify, and some of that's also a function of when, if the child was born in the United States or spent most of their formative years here versus coming later. So the extent that one identifies with the African American cultural experience or not is going to vary within that specific immigrant group. And so if you don't see your experience represented, that's another cue that more work really does need to be done.
Thank you. Is there another question? We can move on.
Hello, my name is Alan Mecca. I kind of wanted to push on the point of fluidity. So Colleen Ward actually recently came up with a model within the immigrant psychology literature, identifying alternating style as a way in which people who come from two cultural streams, their heritage as well as the receiving context, switch back and forth between these two identity frameworks. So kind of like cultural frame switching, but really more focused on the shifting between two identities. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention, Carlos, because I know you mentioned that not enough research is doing this, but within immigrant psychology, we have this understanding that as immigrants more or less generally gravitate towards biculturalism the longer that they are here, and second-generation immigrants as well gravitate towards biculturalism over time. There's this new growing focus on looking at what biculturalism actually means. So you see Bennett Martinez's work on bicultural identity integration, but also this focus on how these identities manifest in moments to moments. And I also wanted to bring up the triculturalism work that was talked about here. Yeah, there's going to be heterogeneity in terms of the experiences for Black immigrants, but it's also important to acknowledge context as well. And it's not just how long they've lived, it's also where they're living. In some contexts, identifying with the larger African American community may serve as a protective factor to have kind of a home base to be able to identify with. Versus in other contexts, for example, like in Miami, that has one of the largest Haitian enclaves, identifying with the Haitian community may take first and foremost precedence.
I guess just to very quickly clarify, I may have misspoken, but what I was trying to suggest is that mainstream developmental research on ethnic racial identity development has been relatively not, there's been a tendency, I think in general, and I think we would agree, to sort of treat these labels in a certain static fashion. And so I'm sure, never say there's nothing done in anything, because, right? So if I did, that was my mistake. But I'm sure there's, but I think, in general, for those of us, I think we, regardless of what our entry point, I think we can engage with these questions more fruitfully in a variety of ways. It's sort of essential, generally.
I guess I would disagree with that a little bit, with all due respect to my dear friend, because I think that there is research out there. If you think about the work done on identity at a daily level, for example, that is talking about that. To me, that's about fluidity, right? Like, and moment-to-moment salience. Though that is about fluidity. I don't think there's as much theorizing, so I will agree with that in terms of bringing some of those mainstream constructs, kind of engaging them into a broader theory that sort of thinks about fluidity more explicitly, not just in the design and the methodology or the analysis, but really in the conceptualization. I think that definitely there needs to be more work done in that area. I wanted to say before that your comment about the Haitian Jamaican? I can't remember which. Yeah, no, I think I was thinking Jamaican. Really brought to mind a lot of the issues that really we talked about in our group, which is like, so how do you take into account migration contexts and like the unique experiences of any of these groups, like within their culture of origin, the immigration experience, the migration context, which is what Alan was talking about, right? And also speak to a broader literature. I think that's the tension that a lot of people wrestle with. It's like they sort of go to the best available measures and theory, and they have this population, and they want to use, they're not necessarily seeking to do a ground-up study. We talked a lot about that in my group. Like, how do you do the ground-up, but also kind of contribute to the existing literature and evidence base. And so I think that's sometimes you reach a point where you realize that this isn't going to work, like this is not tenable. I have to actually develop a new theory, which is I think what Gail Ferguson did, and it's been very helpful to many people in the field. But then also that this measure doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to think about white racial socialization given like the existing measure. It doesn't make sense to think about black racial socialization in this immigrant household because there's all this other stuff that's not being captured, and new measure needs to be developed. And I think the cultural psychology and ethnic psychology world is really good about developing measures to capture those like more nuanced phenomena and experiences. But I think migrating that a bit to developmental science, there's definitely a lag there, and there's more. We should minimize a bit, because I think our colleagues over there in that world, they really do think about these issues and have good measures. Yes, that's right. Yes. Right.
Well, and salience of a particular identity is, I'm sort of highlighting how individuals might fluctuate across different identities. So like when I do survey, that's my point. Yeah. And so when I do surveys, there are often white kids who write, my race is human. Right? When do when is human no? I mean, I'm just sort of, that's what I'm sort of bringing attention to.
Okay. I hate to stifle this great conversation, but we are between lunch, so we are sitting before them eating. Yes, so lunch is outside. Please feel free to go. There's a lot of us, so we'll try to move quickly. Grab some lunch, come back inside, and we have about an hour to network, and we will be back at 1:00 to start the next breakout session.